This webinar is hosted by 2021 AI, and we focus on giving you a high-level perspective on how to manage AI under the new regulation and an understanding of who is going to be impacted. We will not be deep diving into the act itself, but rather give you the key takeaways. My name is Christine. I'm public sector lead at 2021 AI, and together with me I have Michael, who's our CEO, and who's here to discuss and highlight the impact of the new EU Act. Some practical information at first. This is the first time that we host a webinar in the format of a one-to-one discussion and with a Q&A at the end. So Michael and I, we will spend the first 30 minutes covering the new regulation and its impact, and then we'll answer your questions at the end of the webinar. So feel free to share your questions on the Q&A button at the bottom of the webinar, and then we will try and address them in the last 15 minutes of the webinar. The Artificial Intelligence Act marks the end of more than 3 years' work in which 2021 AI has proudly taken part. We're pleased to see the outcome, and we would like to share our perspectives and some proposed action with you today. This is the agenda for today. We've already been over the introduction, and so next up will be the discussion on the AI regulation and the impact it's going to have. And after this, we're very lucky to have Pamela Jasper, the CEO of Jasper Consulting, join us to give her views and perspectives on similar US and global initiatives. Let's get this going, Michael. I'd like to start the webinar by asking you about the timeline for the proposal. How do you figure it will look until we reach the legalization?
Thank you very much, Christine, and thanks to everyone participating on the call today. It's a great pleasure that you decided to take out 1 hour of your time and spend it with us today. As Christine alluded to, we're going to do this pretty high level. This is going to be a overview of what to expect from the process going forward with the whole EU AI Act. So also, please bear in mind, it's not that we don't want to host really detailed workshops. We had one last week with a lawyer firm we partner with, going very deep into the areas of AI for municipalities. But such a workshop typically requires another 3.5 to 4 hours. So we'll do that later. But we'll start with this today. So yes, if we look at the timeline for the proposal, the timeline actually, when I go back, I'm not going to go back to all the legal text around this. I'm going to go back to where the high-level expert group started working with this. And what we saw from the high-level expert group were some output in terms of the ethical guidelines for trustworthy AI. We saw the assessment list for trustworthy AI. And basically, that was around a oriented type regulation. And it was also with a very strong focus on a risk-based approach. And that is also what we've seen carried through into the current version of the proposal for the AI Act in the EU, which we saw for the first time 21st of July. So where we are right now, at this point in time, there's actually something that is defined as a post-proposal consultation that goes on to the 1st of July. And to my knowledge, what I heard from experts in this area is actually the first time that the EU work with such a post-proposal consultation. And when we look at that, we actually see that it's already been very successful. So I'm here in my hands with the European Data Protection Board's response to this. And it's a pretty dense, it's a pretty detailed response really going into the areas where they believe that the act needs to be more explicit. It's areas where how does this connect to the EU and so on and so forth. So also bear in mind that what we see now to go through or more. So what will happen now is that the European Parliament, or post this, Parliament and Council will have their opinions, they will have their debates, so on and so forth. And then at a certain point, this act will be published. So once published in an official paper, it takes 20 days for this actually to enter into force. And then up to another 24 months before this is fully in force. So it's not all going to be thrown at us from the beginning, most likely not at least, and then it's going to gradually be put into force. So when we look at this, we look at a pretty long timeline. We look at a timeline of moving into 2024, which for most certainly is a long timeline. But then again, it also depends on how well prepared you are to actually comply with the EU's act, right? So if you're an organization that already have strong governance procedures, you might have risk management procedures, you might even have systems to entertain, support your model development, well, then it probably is more than enough time. But with other organizations with less governance, with less compliance in place across the organization, this is actually time to start reacting now. It's time looking into how can I make myself ready for this. Also, please note that the EU AI Act is only one of actually a stream of acts we're seeing coming from the EU for the moment. So in connection with the AI Act, we have at least the four mentioned at the bottom here that we see coming up now. But besides that, the EU is sort of really open to offer us more acts in other areas. So a key point here, I believe, for organizations is really to think carefully about how do I handle this mosaic of different acts? How do I make sure that I actually comply with the impact assessments that each of these acts actually prompts me to fill in? So as an organization, how do I avoid doing too much double work? How do I make sure that I don't drown in pen and paper-based filling in impact assessments constantly? And then also please bear in mind that when we're looking at, and what we're looking at now is only with the EU. And if you have a more global outlook, you probably will have other regulations, compliance restrictions that you have to comply with. And that probably going to foster even more impact assessments. But towards the end, I will go into more details around that and offer a solution to organizations, at least how to start engaging on such a process, such a journey.
Great. Thank you for that insight. But maybe it would be an idea to have an elaboration on the definition that this AI Act has on AI.
Most certainly. So again, if we look at this now, we have actually decided to take the EU's, European Commission's slide that they shared with the Act. So that's what you see on the screen here. And if we look at that definition, it's a pretty broad definition of AI, artificial intelligence. And if we dig even a bit further down to that, we will see that in the close definition into this, it's not AI. Right? It's not AI. It's AI. It's machine learning. It's any knowledge-based process. It's any statistical approach that we're working with. So a point here is certainly for organizations to be aware of the fact that this is much broader than AI. This is basically all models that could impact in some shape or form.
Okay, so a very broad definition of AI and models.
Very broad.
That prompts the question: who is then going to be impacted by the regulations?
Yeah, most certainly. So first point here is that it's any company operating within the EU. It also means that you don't have to be a European company, of course, to be operating in the EU. So this also goes for anyone who wants to sell a product into the EU. And what we see here is that the producers, the developers of AI products will have to go through a CE marking we're going to go into more details around what that comprise of. But the term CE marking is something we see for a lot of different products going into the EU for them to be sold across the whole EU. So that's the sort of development, the producer side of these models. But then also please note that it's also the users, it's the consumers, and that also goes if the AI model is within another product, or you're using an AI component of the product in your organization. And if we look into then what is the obligations on that side, well, there certainly are less obligations that you see on the development producer side, but there are obligations, and certainly you have to comply with the instructions given by the producers of these models. That's the key point around this. But there are also some restrictions in terms of gathering data for some of these models, if you can access the data. And there's also special cases if you're a financial institution and you're working with credit models, then you will have more direct reporting to do. But my point with this is really another point. So the point here is, again, if we go back to the very broad definition of what a AI model is, and think about how many places across my enterprise could I actually have AI, or not just AI, but a model embedded in some shape or form. So the enterprise is super important for everyone also operating these models, because what we'll see is of course that any company out there will want to use better products with more AI, with more intelligence, but now certainly be really careful to get this enterprise view correct.
Great, thank you, Michael. Before we move to my next question, I just want to repeat that if you have some questions, you can prompt them as we go along in the Q&A box at the webinar. So, but we're starting to touch a little bit about the different kinds of models, and thereby also a key central question in this, the different risk categorizations of models. What should companies be aware of in terms of these?
Well, first, let's very quickly go through this risk-based approach, as mentioned already in the beginning. And again, as you can see, this is directly from the European Commission. So that there's 4 levels of risk defined here. So one is the unacceptable risk, which is the models that are prohibited. And then we have the high-risk models, and those are the models that we're going to zoom a bit more in on today. And the EU themselves believe that it's between 10 to 15% of all models that actually falls in this category. And I believe that's a pretty high percentage, right? So it's not like a very small niche couple of percent. No, it's 10 to 15%. So it's quite a lot of models that actually will fall in this category. And then you have the AI with specific transparency obligations and minimal and no risk. One point here is also that it's possible to opt in the high risk model, to opt in on the CE marking of your models, even though your model fall in the other categories. And we probably will see that. We are seeing companies out there with a great interest to demonstrate how they use technology at large, certainly AI and data, in a responsible way. So people will opt in, but then again, it has to really be worth it to get the CE mark. Otherwise, it's a lot of compliance you have to go through.
Okay. So when working with high-risk AI, can you maybe elaborate a little bit more on the requirements that we need in able to comply with this?
Yes. So this is a key slide, and of course we are going to share these slides with everyone afterwards. But this Annex 3, where we define the 8 areas of application of AI that will fall under the AI high risk category, is of course super important. But again, please note that for good reasons, this list is not carved in stone. So the EU opens the possibility to change the list, to extend the list, and I think actually that's quite understandable. So one reason for this is AI is still a maturing technology, and there might be use cases. There will be use cases going forward. There will be industries applying AI in ways we have not seen yet. So again, when we look at this AI Act from the EU, it will be open. And I know this is, of course, unpleasant for a lot of people, but I think there's good reasons for this. So another way to look at this is, and again, this was also offered from the EU Commission, this diagram where we can see where to what happens if you follow this and you have a prohibited model. Well, then stop. If you can get additional certification on this, then you might be able to operate this, right? So again, super high level when you look at such a diagram. But I really think the good news here is that we are starting to see initiatives to support this, meaning that I believe actually it was yesterday that the OECD closed their hearing on the framework for classifying AI systems. So the OECD is working on an open source project that actually can help people to classify the risk and the risk impact of their models. Good.
So it's quite clear that there are a lot of requirements when working with high risk AI. What are the key takeaways from this, in your opinion?
See, now looking at these requirements for high risk AI, we are touching upon the subject that I mentioned in the beginning: implementing risk management processes, implementing risk management solution systems to support you with your compliance for high risk AI models. And this is where, again, it becomes very tangible. There's a lot of information in this Title 3, Chapter 2 on what you need to do. There's a lot of details, and some of these details are already being discussed. And if we take the top one around training, validation of test data, I believe it's said in the Act that training data has to be accurate and complete, and that of course has generated a lot of attention, because many would argue that that is probably not possible. So again, these are areas under development where we should expect to see some changes. Now, looking at the next layer. Now, if we can go back one slide. So looking at the next layer here around the documentation, I believe this is it becomes really cumbersome for many people. Again, going back to how much pen and paper, how many impact assessments, how much documentation can you fill in an organization that have an ambition to run or develop not one, but 100 models over time. Here, that's really a call for automated documentation, so this do not become insufficient and dated. So a lot of again, I would say platform thinking here needs to go in on how you develop your models. Then looking at the next 3 layers of this, the transparency, human oversight, robustness, accuracy, and cybersecurity. These are also terms we heard already from the ethical guidelines for trustworthy AI. So again, we see this has carried through on this journey, and quite a few people actually have been engaging already on those guidelines. So that's the good news. The bad news here is, of course, that this is going to be super heavy for a lot of people. Thank you.
So it's quite clear that compliance will be a key takeaway.
Yes.
But can you give us a perspective on the cost that will be related to staying compliant?
Yes, or maybe the EU can. We're taking these numbers from the EU study to support impact assessments and regulatory requirements. So if we look at these five areas, these has again carried through from what we saw, the five compulsory areas that you have to be complying with in the EU Act. So EU's estimate here is that you need to be spending more than 29,000 euros per year per model to stay compliant with this. And that is covering the areas of training data, documentation, record keeping, information positioning, human rights, robustness, accuracy, and cybersecurity. So is that a large or small amount? Well, I guess it depends on who you ask if this is a large or small amount, but it certainly is a real cost and an estimate again from the EU for this. I think the problem with some of these estimates is more that it's only the very direct labor cost the EU has taken in here. So what is missing in this is actually that there's a lot of derived cost. So if you look at derived cost on your procurement, on your communication, maybe your board, these costs are certainly not in here. So these are the direct costs, and now this is only the labor compliance cost. On top of that, there will be the certification cost for getting your model certified and get your CE mark from the EU. And that amounts to actually, again, the bigger companies, they might decide to do their own internal quality management system. And again, in this estimate, this is estimated to be an investment of between 193,000 to 330,000 just in the development cost. And on top of that, you had, as you could see in the last slide, another 71,400 euros. So this is a quite substantial amount. There's also the alternative that you can actually buy such services from an external provider. And there the estimate is in the neighborhood of between 16,800 and 23,000. So all in all, you should expect per year more than 52,000 euros. And again, depending on who you are, depending on where you are, this could be a challenge. And most certainly, this could be a challenge for the SME sector in Europe, the startups. Good news is that the Act actually opens for, I'm reading up here, loud here, measures to support reduction of regulatory burdens for SMEs, startups, and the creation of digital hubs and testing facilities. But looking at how that is specified so far, it's not very clear. And it's not very clear how this is going to be handled. But it is something that the EU has to start working on to support this whole segment going forward.
All right. Well, thank you. Now we have an overview of the requirements and costs related to being compliant.
Yes.
We know that there might be penalties imposed if you do not comply. How do you figure they will look?
Yes. So now finally at slide 11, we get to the point that we push the seminar out where we look at the fines, we look at the penalties. And yes, the penalties are severe. The penalties are super severe in this area, right? So for infringing prohibited practices, data governance is up to 6% of your global annual turnover, 30 million euros, whatever is largest of the two. And then being non-compliant with the AI system or requirements of obligation, we are up to 4%, and 20 million euros, whatever is the largest of the two. And then supplying incorrect information, incomplete information, misleading information, we are 2% of your global annual turnover, 10 million euros, whatever is largest. So these are pretty heavy fines, right? And we have to bear in mind that if we look at the Gdpr, that is equal to the midsection here, the 4%, 20 million. So the EU is actually taking this quite serious, and we see that also from the size of these fines.
Absolutely. So now we're touching a bit upon the compliance for models. What are the most important factors to keep in mind, in your opinion, here?
Yes. So if we look at this, what we try to assemble here is a broader view on both data and model governance from a more complete risk compliance governance framework. And again, let's remember that at the highest level, there are these legal requirements where the EU Act for AI is one of them. But there's certainly also others. So as we saw in the beginning, there are other acts from the EU, and there's probably also other legal requirements from elsewhere in the world that you want to comply with. So already at this point, it's clear that it's not one area that I can isolate my efforts to. So also another area mentioned by the EU for the mid-level risk models is establishing code of conduct. But code of conducts are many things. So code of conducts could also be internal code of conduct, how you work with technology at large, how you make sure that you have a responsible way of doing it. It can be anything around you can say, how do you break up the responsibilities across your delivery chain and so on and so forth. Then also looking into this, we have ethical principles. So here locally in Denmark, all companies, I believe it is with more than 200 employees, actually needs to submit by this year their ethical principles for working with data and models. And also just yesterday we saw from the UNESCO their ethical principles, and I certainly believe that there's a lot of organizations out there who would like to comply with these also. So if we look at the next point here, and this goes back to what was already mentioned on the first slide, that each of these, the legal requirements, the code of conducts, the ethical principles, they probably all come with some risk impact assessments. And this is where you really need to be careful as an organization, and you need to be concerned about how much pen and paper can I actually absorb in my organization. So what we are talking into here is a more versatile approach, where you constantly can update, of course, your impact risk assessments, but also in the nature, and we see that from the AI Act here also, that these will also change over time. If we look at another area where we certainly will have a lot to do as organizations, following up on what we see here on top are the risk indicators. And we have very precise risk indicators now in this act for certain areas. We'll have the same for other legal requirements. So again, the flexibility we need on the way we handle impact assessments, we need to have the same for our risk indicators. So we need to have a framework where we can define and redefine such risk indicators. And what this really leads to is, again, a point being made a couple of times, but again, we have to think beyond this pen and paper-based approach. We need to think about documentation, automatic documentation. We need to think about digital trace of what's going on within our organization, how we work with not just data models, but also the processes that we actually have around this. And all that, of course, should lead to a more comprehensive, better audit trail that we can supply to auditors, to anyone who would be interested in this. And one stakeholder there certainly is the EU. We know that for a fact.
Yeah, absolutely. So, but we need to round up a little bit here, and I just have one final question for you.
Yes.
How do you expect the rest of the world to respond to this act?
Yeah, that's very exciting, and not only do we talk to people on the outside of the EU and how they follow this, and they do follow this. They do follow this with great interest. But I think it's actually also a question that we could take up with Pamela joining us now.
That's a good idea. Because we are so lucky that Pamela will be joining us now. Pamela Jasper is the CEO of Jasper Consulting. And Pamela is an expert on AI ethics advisory, and she provides program development, training, and audit services. Hi, Pamela. Thank you for joining us today.
Hi, thank you, Christine. It's a pleasure to be here and an honor to be joining 2021 AI and Michael and yourself to discuss this important topic today.
Absolutely. Thank you. So I'd like to start out by asking you, in your more than 25 years of working with model risk management, how does this EU Act measure in similar initiatives?
Yeah, absolutely. Well, as Michael just mentioned, the European Act was drafted on or about April 21st of this year, and it provides a wide coverage of requirements that are risk-based requirements for companies who develop artificial intelligence, deep learning, or machine learning products which target the European Union residents. My background includes many, many years of experience in managing model risk management programs for USA banks. And so I appreciate the question because there are a lot of similarities. Model risk management was initiated in the United States by the Federal Reserve Board and the OCC back in 2011. I believe in response to the US credit crisis and their recognition of the impact that having poorly developed or inaccurate models and their impact to the American financial ecosystem. The model risk management program that was developed in the United States is based on a regulation called SR 11.7, and it covers many areas of best practices, including having an organization must create a model inventory or identify a model grade or assess risk. Yet one of the things that SR 11.7 is not focused on is artificial intelligence specifically. So I have noted that there are many parallels between the two. For example, in the European Union regulation, Title 3, I think it's Article 7, it talks about how high-risk AI applications must be assessed prior to being moved into production. And Article 13 refers to the need for a quality management system. I think there's another article that talks about the need for a conformity assessment. So these are all parallel to the model risk management practice of a rigorous model validation process. That's performed by a model validation control team. Another similarity would be, I think it's Article 9 of the European Union regulation that talks about documentation and transparency. And again, in SR 11.7, we see this parallel with the need for a fundamental model inventory tool and model inventory and which can support some of the things that Michael was just describing in terms of a digital trace across all of the model's activities. You'll need to be able to trace and track and identify an individual model through every part of not only your model development life cycle, but now what will become your governance life cycle. So I encourage the audience and everyone listening who may be charged with adapting a program, a governance program to prepare for these European Union regulations to consider adopting a model risk management approach.
Yeah, thank you for that. And looking at similar AI regulatory initiatives, what is the current development within the US?
Yeah, no, this is a great question. And I was talking to someone last night about this. As you know, the European Union regulation um, has a specific scope in terms of not only products and product types, but also the target market, meaning AI that's produced and targeted toward European Union residents will be in scope for these fines and these requirements that we've been discussing today. The European Union isn't the only country that's developed AI regulations. I believe Canada has a set of regulations. Singapore is a very popular country with a popular set of even model-based regulations. The UK, Australia. So many countries have regulations, and in the United States, I've learned that there are also several regulations. Now, these regulations to date, to my knowledge, are not proscriptive, meaning they are still at the level of best practice. But you also can note that they are across various, not only across various levels of the government, so some are more local or regional based, and some are at the federal level, but they're also across different verticals and different industries. So we have in the United States, we have, for example, the NIST, the Department of Defense, and their JAIC arm, which promotes responsible and trustworthy AI. Just last night, I saw a published document on the Government Accounting Office, the GAO, has published a set of frameworks around trustworthy AI. The FTC, the FDA, even the Department of National Intelligence has a set of frameworks, as well as the OMB and then the White House at the federal level. So there are many regulations, and then finally, of course, the one that I have that we all know and love, SR 11.7, which is not. I kind of don't include that in this definition because it's not proscriptively focused on artificial intelligence, whereas the others are focused on artificial intelligence. But I think that they would do well to have a model risk management fundamental approach. And one of the things that I think that will be necessary for companies, for the big tech companies like Google or Microsoft, who obviously develop products, AI products that will sit and span across all of these verticals, not only in the USA, but across other countries. It's going to be important for them to think about how to reconcile these regulations, meaning they will need to have a program in addition to their regular governance to identify and keep an eye out for all of the regulations and any changes in both global and US or country-based regulations and requirements and best practices, looking at them by shared principles, by product types, by the type of AI product that they develop, by the type of consumer market that they market that product to, obviously the country domicile wherein they are, and finally, the minimum coverage required, meaning if one or more of these federal regulations or country or sovereign-based regulations require over 100 different itemized atomic requirements, what are the minimum number of requirements that I need to develop that that as Michael mentioned, my labor cost, projection, will I make an investment into that guarantees that I've covered, 80% at least of all of them, and 100% of the main ones where I have the most target marketing product for that segment. So these are some of the considerations that I think that some of the members of our audience and just some of our target market in terms of chief risk officers, chief data officers need to consider when thinking about global regulations in AI, and also even those that are focused here in the United States.
Mm-hmm. Well, thank you. That sums it up very nicely, and it was very insightful. Thank you, Pamela.
Absolutely. Thank you so much.
And you will also take part in the Q&A that we're about to enter into now. So if any of you out there also have a question or two for Pamela, feel free to share your questions in the Q&A. We're going to start the session now, and we'll be able to see some of the questions that we have up here. I think this one will be for you, Michael.
Yes, so let me try to offer a response to this one. So I do not believe that people will be developing conformity assessments. I believe that these conformity assessments will be given from the EU and then for organizations to comply with, right? So this is going to be a format that you're going to be receive, and this is how you're going to conform with this. And that's the area we talked about to make sure that how do I get through that. So it's only once I got my conformity assessment done, I will get my CE marking. And then I think the right question around this would also be, well, how often do I need to do this, right? Mm-hmm. And that's a very, I think it's a question with a lot of dilemma built into it, because if you don't go for a renewal at a given point in time, then you sort of are stuck with the same model, and you probably would want to extend the way your model, how your model work. But basically, you could have a conformity assessment that is given to you or around once you complete the conformity assessment and you got your CE marking. Such mark actually could stay for up to 5 years. The EU has stipulated.
Mm-hmm. And Pamela, do you have any comments to this question?
Not particularly. I agree with Michael that this will be driven by the European Union. I think that companies may want to consider, some of the best practices that are being developed by individual companies who are designing approaches to how to assess or how to audit your systems, so that might help them to prepare for this type of a conformity assessment. But ultimately, it will be driven by the European Union.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely. Thank you so much, Maria, for this question. Now we'll move on to the next question, and I'm just going to read it out loud as soon as I see it. So, do you expect that this AI Act will have the same impact in the US as when GDPR was enforced? And I guess this question is going out to you, Pamela, especially.
Yes, I do. I think that it will have the similar impact that the GDPR had when it was enforced. GDPR required that US companies who create applications that use or leverage any personally identifying information of European Union persons, that those systems conform to certain data privacy standards. And I think that because the focus is on the European persons in both acts, both the GDPR and the European Union Artificial Intelligence Act, that it will have a similar effect of normalizing or raising raising the bar across all organizations. So again, thinking about what is the minimal or maximum amount of requirements that a company can design towards will allow them to meet the most a number of requirements in the European Act and across other global organizations and sovereign global regulations. GDPR, the GDPR was European based, as is the European Union Act, but other countries will have similar acts and similar requirements to the European Union.
Yes, thank you for that. And do you have a comment, Michael?
Yes, I certainly do have a comment on this also, and I like your point about normalization, leveling out, Pamela, because just recently we had a good workshop with a US-based client, and initially they were the opinion that, well, this act would actually only impact the models that they wanted to deploy in Europe towards end clients. But then they and we soon realized that that's probably not going to work very well, right? Because how do you explain your US clients that you have one set of governance once you're working with the model in Europe and another set of governance when you're doing this in your home market? I don't think that will be well received by any end consumers out there, and it will probably generate a headache for the one. So what I think will happen is still to be seen, of course, is that this is going to be a higher watermark for what we'll see across the Atlantic also.
Mm-hmm. Thank you for that question. That was an anonymous one. The next one is up here. Is the UK signed up to this? For example, does this apply if all your models are solely UK based and applied? This is from Paul.
The UK will have their own set of rules and are working on that for the moment. We haven't looked at it recently. A lot of papers is actually coming out from the UK. I don't know if this is after Brexit, but it seems to be working much faster than we see from Europe. So a lot of things are happening there, and what we've seen so far is certainly resembles what would be seen from the EU. But to the question, yes, I would certainly think that you only have to comply with your local UK regulation in this area, but expect that there will be regulation also in the UK that sort of resembles exactly what we're seeing from the EU.
Exactly. And Pamela, this was also something you touched upon, the UK. Do you have any additional comments to this?
Yeah, no, my thoughts were just to concur with that. That as of this moment, they're separate. If you are designed and solely based and applied to the UK, you are not covered by the European Union regulations. However, it really takes looking at your use cases to identify those that really truly can be only targeted towards UK residents and to the exclusion of anyone else in the surrounding European Union area. So, I would caution that an organization who's designing or has that particular market and those particular use cases to just be careful because the moment that a resident in the European Union uses that application, then they become exposed to those requirements.
Thank you for that, Pamela. And we have the next question up already. So how do you ensure that the AI solutions are respecting minorities and it's inclusive? Which part of the regulation program is in charge of this? And the question is from Maria.
So I can offer a first response to this, Pamela, before you look into this. First, unfortunately, I cannot right now point to where in the regulation this actually sits, but we certainly can follow up on this, Maria, because it's in there. And the reason why I'm saying that with so much conviction it's one of these areas that are super sensitive. It's one of these areas where regulation, both for AI, for models, for data, really are very forceful. And I think that if you actually have well, respecting minorities is one, but discriminating minorities, well, then you're very close to the prohibited area with your model if you're not already in there. So these are certainly the areas that we see a lot of good emotions for in the EU and in the AI Act. Palma, I saw you also had a feedback on this.
Yeah, no, absolutely. And that makes a lot of sense. Thank you, Michael. My thoughts are that, so in the European regulation, I think it's Title III that focuses on high risk AI requirements. And they're technically defined, or their scope is defined in Annex 2. And within Title III, Article 8, it talks about that these AI systems which are moving into production should have no form of bias, either intentional or unintentional, and that includes not only when the system is developed, but once it is deployed, so that the system must be formally assessed based on certain criteria. So that's the part of the regulation. And I just summarized it at a very high level. There may be finer tuned details, in terms of its prescription. I would also caution anyone in terms of the regulation, if and where, to the degree that it represents or mentions, or we're looking at the term minorities, that across each global domicile and across each region, who makes up a minority changes. And so it's really important, again, going back to our other conversations about looking at and reconciling your regulations, because your culture, your terms change from region to region.
Thank you for that.
Yeah, so what would make up one minority in one country, in an African country, they may not be a minority, as an example.
Yes, that's a great example, actually. Thank you. So many thanks to the speakers for their great presentations. One guest is writing, how do you think the standardization organizations are going to deal with those new requirements? Where do you see room for just adapting old standards? And what types of requirements for the AI Act are likely to need completely new standards? This is a question from Leonard.
Yes, so let's kick that off. So the standardization organizations are super involved in this, and we also been involved working with the Danish standardization organization, and they recently were given the European secretary for looking into AI standards. The good news here is that the standardization organizations are certainly also looking at the EU Act. They're looking at that, and they're probably realizing, or they have realized, that the work going on, they're not talking on their behalf, but what we see from the outside actually has to be harmonized. It has to filter in towards what we're seeing from the EU. It also seems like the EU and what we're seeing from the EU sort of is going to be the top legislation, is going to be the top that you have to comply with. Mm-hmm. So what we're seeing now is I believe that there is going to be some conformity moving towards that. On the other hand, I will also say that what we're also seeing now is a explosion of guidelines, requirements, best practices, what have you out there. Mm-hmm. So that will probably continue for a little while still, and then we will probably see that all of this will condense in to being more explicit, and that is going into the second part of the question, that there certainly will be adaptation of what we see in some of the work already done. The last part of the question, what type of requirements are likely to need completely new standards? Well, that's still to be seen. But as said, we now have this post-hearing period where there's going to be a lot of feedback to the EU on this. There's going to be a lot of eyes looking at this, actually addressing what we see in this question. So let's wait and see, and in not too distant future, I'm sure there will be some revisions and updates to quite a few of the areas.
Yeah, most likely. Pamela, do you have a comment on this?
Yeah, absolutely. No, I concur exactly with what Michael was saying. The European Act itself right now is a broad set of standards and will sufficiently in itself, in a way, this act will be the driver of other standards and not other standards being the driver of this act. But when we look at standards, I can appreciate that our compliance officers, are looking at hundreds of new potential frameworks and standards on the market, and they'll need to identify and select those that are best fit for their particular area. Things to consider are, is it a high-level standard versus a detailed standard? Meaning, the European Act says that the European Union Artificial Intelligence Act says that there is a need for documentation and transparency, but it doesn't prescribe that you must have explainable AI. However, explainable AI is becoming a best practice as a form of transparency. So there are standards that are being developed locally and specifically for different types of models around XAI, and you may want to augment the European Union Act with those XAI standards. Another thing to consider is industry versus core. To me, the European Union regulations are very, very much a large set of detail, and yet they're still core. They don't talk about all of the nuances, let's say, in the medical industry, or the Internet of Things in terms of devices, or the DoD, or in financial services. So in the United States and abroad, you're going to see this distinction between core regulations and requirements versus nuanced or industry specific. Think of it as a hub and spoke.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. Unfortunately, we're going to have to round up the Q&A already. But thank you all so much for your great questions. We're sorry we couldn't address all of them. And also thank you to you, Pamela, for taking part in the webinar and also for joining the Q&A. It was very insightful having you here. Thank you so much. We've been working on a brochure, and we will be sharing this with all of you participating here today. So you will receive a link for this in your email very soon. But to round up the webinar, Michael, I have a final question for you. We've been talking a lot about which companies and organizations that the new act will impact. But what about the functions within a company? How will they be affected, and are there any things we can do to prepare for this?
Yes, most certainly. Thank you for that question. So as you sense today, even though we have not deep dived into all the technical aspects of the act, this has still been at a relatively technical level in terms of how to comply with this EU act. As mentioned earlier in my presentation, also we believe that there's quite a few companies out there, organizations out there, who needs to consider how this impacts the derived effect, so to speak, of the EU Act. So what we will be doing is hosting a seminar in August, where we'll talk more into that. We'll talk more into board involvement, business leader accountability, continuous monitoring. That was very much what we were talking about today. The role of purchasing, the role of you know, what should you look out for before you actually enter into an agreement with providers of such technologies? And then finally, communication. How do you communicate this? How do you stay strong on that also? So that was all from me.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Thank you. No, thank you all for participating and for your interest and all the great questions that you sent. Again, we're sorry we couldn't address all of them, but feel free to reach out to us. We'd love to continue the dialogue. And so thank you for joining and have a lovely afternoon.
Thank you all.